I'd like to begin by thanking you for inviting me here today. And I was going to give my talk today in English. I think that's most appropriate for my subject. I hope that's okay with all of you. And I'm going to be talking about the language policies of the European Union from a very critical perspective. I'm very critical of the Commission and the decisions that they've made. I'm very critical of Erasmus. So that's a good background, that we're looking at the language policies of the European Union and we find them to be inadequate. The first one here is rather difficult to see. I'm sorry about that, but what it shows is what we've already heard today, that English is the language which is being studied by more than 95% of all children in the European Union. And that's kind of my beginning point. But I'd just like to review very quickly what is the language policy of the European Union. There are many different versions depending on who you talk to. But we certainly can bring up this idea that every member state has an official language which they can nominate to the European Union, and every citizen of the European Union can use any one of those languages when they're communicating with the EU. And this is to support languages. So that would be perhaps the basis, if you will. We also have the call for plurilingualism. I'm presupposing that Erasmus is intended to promote plurilingualism. And that is an important part of the language policy of the EU, as well as the idea that the European Union is supporting lesser used, minority, and endangered languages. What I want to look at quickly here, if you will, to begin, are three aspects. And this would be that there are three working languages: English, French, and German. Also the idea that everyone in Europe should be speaking three languages, which I don't believe is going to happen anytime soon. And the use of English in the European Union, which is a much wider subject, of course. So if we could begin going back to this original map of Europe, if you will, we see very clearly that English is mandatory throughout the European Union. There's no longer a member state not promoting English as the first language that students use in practice. So there are young people learning other languages, of course, going to French schools and so on. But that does not mean that those students are not learning English, nevertheless. What I think is the most interesting aspect of this is that it is extremely successful. That is to say, students that are studying English in the European Union are learning English. They're learning to speak English well. They have a very high level of proficiency. They're learning how to write English. And this must be kept in mind when we compare the outcomes, the success of learning other languages, which are primarily French, Spanish, and German. The outcomes are not as successful. So what we have today in the European Union is a whole generation of young people where each year we can measure and see clearly that they are gaining, they're constantly gaining in their competence in English. And this means at the same time that English is crowding out other languages when it comes to important domains. So, I mean, we have the world expert on this subject here with us today, that English is a killer language. And one of the most interesting things I think about this subject is that it seems to be the case that the leaders of the European Union are paralyzed. They're incapable of even discussing this issue, that English is growing by leaps and bounds in the European Union. Now, 5 years ago, when we were all shocked, woke up one morning and turned on our televisions and discovered that Great Britain was leaving the European Union, I began to do work on what that might mean. What does Brexit mean? And I came to the conclusion that English was going to become much stronger in mainland Europe as a result of Brexit. And now we have 5 years to look back, and what we see is, yes, it has become much, much stronger. What is the reason for that? We can only speculate. But it probably has something to do with the fact that that movement was already well underway. That school systems throughout the European Union were bringing English into their school systems, that children were embracing that. And one result there, interestingly enough, is they have less interest in learning a third language. If we look at the statistics themselves, and these are from 2018, what is interesting here is not that so many pupils are learning English and being successful at it, but that we actually have a decline in the learning of French and German. It is now the case, actually, that Spanish has now overtaken both French and German by a considerable margin. And where are people learning French? Well, certainly not in Eastern Europe and in the Nordic countries. And this is one of the reasons why this tension which currently exists between French and German, that the French feel that we should start using a lot more French in the European Union, it isn't backed up by the statistics. There aren't enough citizens of the European Union to make French a possibility as a European lingua franca. But there are other considerations as well, and that is that French has been in decline steadily for more than 20 years. Some of you are old enough to remember when French film was quite the fashion, and we would go to the cinema and watch Italian movies, and we would watch German movies. This is just one example where in popular culture I mean, what happened to French cinema? Where did it go? And now we're watching movies of fantastic creatures that kill each other with unbelievable weapons and so on, and they're all speaking English. So we as we can see in the cultural sphere, where more and more popular culture is in English, we see less and less in French, and certainly in German as well. And as a language that people want to learn, many young people now are saying that they would rather learn Spanish. So something remarkable has happened just in a very, very short time. These are the statistics for being competent in English. There are arguments, what does that mean? At what level do people have competence in English? And my argument there would be, well, if we say that maybe the figures aren't correct for English, well, maybe they're not correct for French and German. So if we take it for granted that these statistics are reliable, we see that being a competent user of English as an L2 in the European Union is 3 times bigger for English than for French and German. If we go back to this discussion of the 3 procedural or working languages, when we hear discussions that French, German, and English are the 3 working languages of the European Union, we get the impression that they are on the same par, that they have an equal stake. The reality is, of course, that we have 1 procedural language in practice, and very little French and German is being used. And I've talked to many people who have told me that they've seen more English, much more English being used just in the last few years. So I think we need to do away with this idea that we have 3 procedural languages. It's an insult in a certain respect to the Italians and the Spanish, who also have very large languages. And then somebody would say, well, why don't we have 5? But I think the fair thing to do is say that we have 24. And let everyone in the European Union have a language which is an official working language. And then we're going to use English anyway. But at least then we're being honest. When it comes to plurilingualism, I want to claim that Erasmus is a complete disaster in promoting plurilingualism. What actually really happens in reality? In reality, schools all across Europe, because they want to get money, are offering their courses in English. Maybe because they want to hold on to their jobs. I think that was what was happening in my university. We had suffering enrollment, so we tried to increase the number of Erasmus students. If you look at what's going on with Erasmus, you discover very quickly that many students are coming to other countries, taking courses in English, and not learning the host country language. I've even talked to Erasmus students who say that they're taking Erasmus to learn English. And then I stop and say, well, where are you going? And they say, oh, I'm going to be studying in Sweden or France or Lithuania. So plurilingualism is not being promoted by Erasmus. I would say as well that we're working against plurilingualism. Because if we have English as a language which is being used for foreign students at universities, that makes English more important. That gives English more resources. And it also solidifies the idea that people would be saying, well, I don't really need to invest in other languages. I can get by in English. English is the most important language. At the same time, advanced research, publishing, the writing of books and so on, the writing of doctoral dissertations and master's theses, they're in English all across Europe. And this is happening in France and Germany as well. So what we really need to do is we need to stop putting resources into English if we want to promote plurilingualism. What we have, if we look even closer, talking about children between the ages of 15 and 20, is we have an increase in bilingualism. So young people today are learning English and then they're thinking, oh, I don't need anything else, I can get by quite well. One example is looking at how you had plurilingualism in Finland, where 50, 75 years ago, many people had Finnish as their native tongue, then they learned Swedish, and then they would learn a third language. If you go to Finland today, don't bother speaking Swedish. People will answer back in English. That's my personal experience. But I have surveyed groups of Finnish youth, and they have told me that they're mostly interested in their competence in English. They don't want to learn Swedish, and they don't really have the time to invest in French, Spanish, or German. So bilingualism is being promoted as opposed to plurilingualism, and it's being done with funding from the European Union. So I'm critical of that, obviously. The last item on the list is the idea of having a European English, our own variety. And I would like to say a few words about that. No? Okay. I would like to say a few words about the idea of European English. In the official documentation for translation and interpretation, it says very clearly that British English is the standard. As a matter of fact, it says something so bizarre. It says that it should be the standard English of Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. And when I hear that, I think, where did the Irish come in? And what you realize, of course, immediately is that this is something which is still with us from before Brexit. So if we just go back 6 years and you ask somebody the question, well, what standard should we have in mainland Europe? People would say, well, it kind of has to be British English because there's more than 60 million native speakers on the other side of the water who are a member, who are committed to European unification, who are committed to the European idea. And to not have their variety as a standard for the EU would be insulting. It would be like somebody saying that we shouldn't have Parisian French as the French standard, or Rikssvenska if it's Swedish. I mean, could you imagine the translators in Luxembourg saying, well, we're going to do Skånska? That would be a similar thing, right? So that they chose British English was perfectly natural and appropriate. But after Brexit, it's still there. And the reason, I believe the reason why, is because the Commission is not keeping their eyes open and watching what's going on. And the people who work in the translation services that are doing this are British. And they have acquired other passports. But they are British, and that's where their loyalties lie. And there are people in this world who think that automatically British English is the best standard. It has some kind of superior quality. What is the reality? The reality is that American English is now much more common across Europe. Perhaps not in your generation. Some of you are speaking something that sounds more like American English. But if we look at children between the ages of 15 and 20, it is American English throughout the European Union. And a few students want to target the British standard. Now, does it matter? In written language, it doesn't really matter that much. It's a question of some spelling and a few simple grammatical structures. But it certainly matters when it comes to identity. How is it possible that we could have a mainland European identity in our lingua franca if our teachers expect us to have a British accent when we speak? The British are gone. They're not with us any longer. They don't want to be part of our party. But we're going to continue trying to speak like them when it comes to pronunciation. It does not make any sense whatsoever from my perspective. So if we said then, well, we should have our own standard, our own variety of English, what would that then be? And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't want to be involved in deciding what that is going to be. Because obviously all of you have understood that I'm an American citizen. I'm also a Swedish citizen, but I'm born and raised in the United States. And I don't think native speakers of British and American English should be involved in your choice for the standard for your L2. I don't think we should adopt American English. That would be my greatest nightmare. Because it has the exact same problem. Mainland Europeans are not American. They're not British and they're not American. They're people who are very competent L2 users of their lingua franca. And they have lexical items which are peculiar to their variety. They have pronunciation. They have some peculiar things like member state. Member state is not a common term used in native speaker varieties. It's something you invented because it's something special. Being a nation that belongs to the European Union is something special, so we say member state. I would be very pleased to see the European Union develop its own standard of spelling, punctuation, the use of special lexical items, and so on and so forth, and codify and standardize standard English, and not put any resources whatsoever into the English language. Because they're backed up by some very powerful economic forces in North America. And they're going to do just fine without us. So I think we need, if we really truly want to have plurilingualism as a policy of the European Union, then we need to put resources and support into our own indigenous languages. We can begin by forcing Erasmus students to study in the language of the host university. Because every time we're funding the way we're doing it right now, we're just pouring money into supporting English. English is a killer language. It has ideologies. God forbid the ideologies of the Republican Party in the United States start spreading in Europe. I'm going to kill myself if that happens. So I really sincerely believe that we need to begin looking at our own standard, our own identity as mainland Europeans that use English as an L2, as a lingua franca. I think that's where we need to go. I think the European Commission has to start talking about this honestly and openly. People that are supporting French and think French is going to take over are living in a fantasy world. It doesn't have the statistics. It's not going to happen. Thank you very much.